Please join me in welcoming Jason Ng.
Great. No, thank you so much for having me, Anne, and especially to Anne and everybody here at Google, and also to the Google policy team. I want to also especially thank Paul Nicholas for helping arrange this talk. So thanks you all for coming out. Hopefully this will be a little lighthearted, fun opportunity for you to learn a little bit about some of the issues that are taking place within the Chinese online sphere, and also about how they affect our own issues here in the US and abroad. So yeah, a lot of people always ask me how I started with this. I was actually a book editor for a long time, and I was an English major, and folks wonder how I got interested in online issues and internet censorship. And I often point them to this one particular chart, which may look familiar to some of you folks who work on Google Trends. This is an image of search volume activity coming out of a particular province in China called Xinjiang in the northwest, from the dates ranging from 2009 to 2010. And even if you don't work on Google Trends, you might be able to tell that something odd is taking place here. Clearly something has dropped off and something didn't happen. And what didn't happen was there was no internet in Xinjiang for roughly 10 months from July 2009 to May 2010. So, and if you don't trust Google's data, you could also perform this same sort of thing on Baidu Index, and you'll get the same sort of thing. For 10 months, there was no internet, essentially, in an entire province in China. And when we're talking about provinces, we're talking about regions that are roughly the size of whole countries in other places. So it was from here that I got really interested in the ability of governments and authorities to really control the online sphere, which a lot of folks thought was completely uncontrollable. There's the famous quote of Bill Clinton saying, controlling the internet is like nailing Jell-O to the wall. And obviously, China has done something to figure out a way to strap Jell-O to the wall. And that way is using various forms of online censorship. However, the only thing is, you probably won't ever find China performing this sort of thing again for multiple reasons. But one, it would scare the bejesus out of economic investors and other businesses. People would flee if China ever turned off the internet in, say, Beijing, if they were faced with some sort of riot or some sort of unrest. So that's one reason. But two, also because there's a whole other sorts of tactics that they can use now. They're much more nuanced and sophisticated than simply just turning off the internet if there's a riot in a province. And some of those are obviously the famed IP blocking and the blacklisting of sites in China, which many of you are, I'm sure, aware of. So YouTube, Facebook, Twitter are all essentially blocked from folks within mainland China. They're blocked from mainland Chinese folks from accessing them through the so-called Great Firewall. And then we have other forms of blocking, like the so-called packet filtering. If you try and reach websites that have certain sensitive keywords on them, you may not be able to get them. But what I'm particularly interested in are the sort of filtering and disruptions that take place on the site level. These are issues that are really complicated and have to deal with a lot with self-censorship by private companies within China who have to deal with government oversight and trying to figure out what do we allow and what do we not allow. And in particular, I'm focusing on search blocks, which is my area of expertise. And I look at search blocks on one particular social media website, Sina Weibo, and how they're implemented and what is actually blocked. So if we move on, but first, what is Sina Weibo? Some of you may have heard about it and been familiar with perhaps its reach and its power now within China. And some folks refer to it as a sort of Twitter copycat, but it's more than just a Twitter copycat. Sure, you all have on Weibo your own 140-character posts that you could put up on your own page, but it also has these ability to, there's polls on the Sina Weibo, there's threaded comments, so you can have conversations on Weibo very easily. There's ways of, dating portal type activity. It's more akin to Facebook than actually just a Twitter microblog site. So what sort of content do you find on Sina Weibo? stuff like this. People posting, this sort of content that you would find in Western media, Western social media. Frivolous, fun pictures of stuffed animals and people's pets. So that's one kind of content that you find on Sina Weibo. However, you also can find stuff like this. Slightly more provocative images that were circulated. This one was from 2012. There was a chemical factory protest in Sichuan, and there was this iconic photo that was circulated across Weibo of a young lady protesting against this building of a PX factory, chemical factory. And this image was circulated eventually before it was actually censored and blocked from being shared on Weibo. So again, like you would find in Western media, Weibo is this powerful tool for not just playful humor, but also for more provocative organizing like you would find in this image. So does the government recognize the power of Weibo? Yes, they do. They realize that Weibo can not only be this force for creating unrest and disturbances and perhaps disrupting what's taking place with the status quo, but also can be this really fascinating way to have oversight over local officials. It's an opportunity to have really great feedback toward internet users. And so there's this quote from this party journal in 2012, the Study Times, where they state, Sina Weibo, it's like a double-edged sword. It not only allows us to respond to crises and provide a tool that is more scientific and more expedient, but also has limitations and negative effects that are very prominent. So the government is aware that they need to control Weibo if they want to make sure that the things stay the same as they are now. So ways that the government goes about it, they've been ramping up on their side, and in response, internet users have been ramping up on their side too. So when the government and authorities implement all sorts of new technology to monitor and surveil citizens and to censor content, internet users respond. So one of the ways that I like to talk about is how government and authorities figured out a way to really quickly highlight and find posts that contain sensitive content by searching for keywords. In response, internet users realized that governments and authorities were doing this, and they decided to embed their text within images, a sort of steganography sort of technique. However, the government then responded in kind by finding sensitive content, sensitive images, and doing sorts of image searches and wiping them out right away. So it's a cat and mouse game that goes back and forth, and it continues to this day. So back to Weibo, some of the more specific ways that the government actually does filter content on Weibo. Posting certain keywords, either by themselves or in combination with other keywords, will give you this really vague message that says, sorry, this content, and if you're interested, that's the keyword says Wen Jiabao, who's the former prime minister in China. And the message that you get is, sorry, this content violates Sina's rules, blah, blah, blah. If you need assistance, please contact customer service. I wish you luck if you feel like contacting them and seeing what they get back. So another way that they do it, simply by deleting content. Content sometimes vanishes from Weibo without a trace, except there have been websites like freeweibo.com that actually suck up all the tweets that get posted on Weibo before they get deleted. And then when they do get deleted, they actually retain a copy of it and then share it with everyone. So this is an image that took place in Ningbo, where this is an image of an event that took place in Ningbo in last week, or 2 weeks ago, actually. We're not quite sure what's happening in the photo, but we do know that apparently policemen are dragging away a man, and the image was censored on Weibo. Someone posted it, and then within a short amount of time, it was no longer on Weibo. And actually, if you try and access it through the API, it'll give you a message that says, sorry, this content doesn't exist, or permission denied. So that's another technique that Weibo is very famed for using to get rid of content. But my particular form of, again, like I said, the information control technique that I'm most interested in is these search blocks. Search blocks are very flexible. You could add words to the list one day, take them off the next day. Content's still there. However, what you're doing is inhibiting people from finding information. So if there's some sort of protest going on, someone wants to look up information on it, if the sort of keywords that they're using to look for it are on that blacklist, they'll get this message that says, due to relevant laws, we can't show you results. And for this one, this keyword is Wen Yunsong, who is actually the son of Wen Jiabao, and he's notable in China for being a billionaire. And you wonder, how did this guy become a billionaire? His father, perhaps? So it's this sort of thing that touches on sensitive issues in China. A lot of times, these words are blocked on Weibo, in addition to being filtered in other ways. So I'm not the only one doing this sort of research. A lot of other folks I was inspired by and have continued my line of work, especially folks at China Digital Times, Gary King at Harvard, folks at the University of Hong Kong who made a great tool called Weibo-Scope, David Baman, Carnegie Mellon and his associates at Carnegie Mellon, and Jed Crandall and his associates at UNM. And greatfire.org, which, like I said, they do free Weibo, which is that tool that I showed before about tracking deleted posts, and also this tool called greatfire.org, where you can actually see over time, historically, the sort of keywords and information that's blocked on Weibo. So this one is showing you across time from March 2012 up to now, how Weibo treated searches for Bo Xilai, who is this corrupt politician, or allegedly corrupt politician who was recently convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his various nefarious activities. And you'll see that based on current events, his name may or may not be blocked. So for instance, you'll see in beginning of April, there's a shift. That was when a lot of the scandals and rumors start to pop up. In late September, there's another shift. That's when he was actually kicked out of the party, and then all of a sudden people were able to search for him. And people claim that that's perhaps due to the fact that the government wanted to continue to allow citizens to criticize him online. So as you could see, there's a correlation between online events and offline events, which seems fairly intuitive, but it's good to have the data there to actually show you. So continuing on, so what did I do? Greatfire, China Digital Times, they do fantastic work in confirming, I think, what is sensitive and what isn't sensitive. So for instance, Bo Xilai is in the news about a corruption scandal. Let's check and see if he's blocked on Weibo to confirm whether or not Weibo thinks he's sensitive and worth blocking. However, what about all the words that we don't know are sensitive? And like, for instance, foot fetish or other things like that. I think that's where I stepped in. What I did was I took a giant list of words, in this case, Wikipedia's article titles in the Chinese language edition, which totaled up to 700,000 keywords. And I ran them through Sina Weibo in this very simple script that tested whether or not each word was blocked or not. And then I recorded them into a database and basically did various things to try and understand why they were blocked, including doing research into the history, the language, and other sorts of things. So in the end, I came up with 500 blocked keywords, and in the book I have 150 of them that I write up in more detail, reasons about why they are considered sensitive in Chinese culture and to the Chinese government. So without context, some of the words that I've organized thematically throughout the book. So words related to government, CCP, politics, and nationalism. So a lot of them are fairly obvious, some of them less so, unless you know the context, which hopefully I provide in the book, and which I'll do with some of these words in more detail later on in the presentation. So some other words about dissent, censorship, and justice. Sex, drugs, immorality. People. Scandals, disasters, and rumors. Some of you may know there's been a big anti-rumor campaign going on in China during the past several months. So rumors are clearly on the mind of the censors these days. Information and media. Security, violence, and other words that deal with people being suppressed. And then other words that I just don't have a clue why. And I think these are actually really remind us that there's a human element involved here. That there are people actually putting these words on the list, and they know what's going on. So, yeah, All right, so we'll just go through a few of the words, and hopefully this will be an opportunity for you guys to give me some shout out if you know why they might be blocked. But here's one. If you don't read Chinese, hopefully the pronunciation might help you out. Any thoughts? There you go. So tank, 坦克, is actually a reference to Tank Man. It was blocked for some time in early 2012. It's actually unblocked now, so now you could search for tanks to your heart's delight on Weibo. But you're not going to see this image on Weibo or through any sort of search engine in China either. So because obviously it refers back to this precarious time in Chinese history in 1989. The day after the soldiers came in and cleared the square, this man stood there on June 5th and blocked a column of tanks from entering or leaving from Tiananmen Square, and that's what we have. Here's another one. Literally, it means hairy bacon. You pronounce it Mao La Rou. Mao means hair, and La Rou is sort of like a preserved meat, like a jerky or bacon. However, Mao isn't only just a word for hair, it's also a surname, Chinese surname. If some of you may know a famous Mao in Chinese history. And so Mao Zedong. And La Rou doesn't also just mean, preserved meat that you eat, but also a different kind of preserved meat. Mao's body, which is laid in state outside Tiananmen Square. So this is an example of a coded keyword where internet users have decided that this is some sort of like coded insult for Mao, but also an insult for the current government. So for instance, they'll say things to the effect of, oh, Mao La Rou certainly wouldn't approve of today's policies, economic reform policies. So it's a way to get around the censors by using words that the censors wouldn't have known to block. However, as I've shown, the censors figured this one out. They blocked it. And the only reason I was able to figure out that internet users were using this word was because it was blocked. In fact, I asked, when I was researching the book and I actually figured out this was a blocked word, I asked multiple native speakers and they had never heard of the phrase. And in fact, it's so obscure. I only found it in a couple of places. In fact, in a recipe for how to prepare Mao La Rou. Apparently you dip it in, nitrate, and eventually it's able to keep in a glass case for up to 40 years. So I think this is an example of the sort of so-called Streisand effect. The fact that someone tried to prevent you from blocking it gave greater prominence to it, because otherwise, who would have known that Mao La Rou was a sensitive term when in fact so few people actually use this thing. So again, internet users being playful and being caught up with. Here's another one. This one is actually not created by internet users, but by official media. In this case, official media in Hong Kong. If you guys aren't familiar, China has this sort of one country, two systems rule, wherein Hong Kong has this sort of more liberal policies with regards to freedom of information, freedom of expression. Their sort of political system is more free than it is in China. And in this case, yeah, so empty stool refers to the empty chair that Liu Xiaobo would have sat in but was vacated at the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. So empty stool was a reference in Hong Kong media talking about the empty stool. And so there you have it. So media is also closely watched, not just internet users. Here's one that internet users were able to contribute to. This one is Yue Yue Now, which literally means month bird. But as an example of the sort of games that internet users like to play, this actually, if you put them together, equals a single character, Peng, in reference to Li Peng, who was the former premier of China. And he was actually the one in June 4, 1989, or back in 1989, who actually pushed for the government to enter into the square and be more assertive about dealing with the protesters. So he's clearly a controversial figure in Chinese current events and history. And so references to his name are sensitive online. So when internet users recognize that you couldn't perhaps use his name or using his name itself, the one with the characters all squished together, using his name as sensitive and may cause your post to be deleted right away. They decide to split it up and as a sort of game to try and get around the censors. Unfortunately, this was also caught, and so now, month bird, the monthly bird is now no longer acceptable discourse on Weibo. Okay, here's one that's more historical in nature, Wu Wang. So it literally means never forget or don't forget. And in this case, this one is actually a reference to a four-character idiomatic phrase in China, Wang Zai Ju, which means don't forget that we're in Ju, the city of Ju, which is, relates back to a historical moment in China wherein this general and his troops were actually surrounded in this small city. And these forces were all around them. And basically he said this phrase to them, don't forget that we're in the city of Ju. And then they fought back and they retook the country back. So any thoughts what parallels that might have to Taiwan? So basically this inscription is actually in Jimin, and it's a reference, and it was put there by Chiang Kai-shek as a sort of rallying cry to tell Taiwanese citizens that we'll come take back the mainland. So clearly that's sensitive, Taiwanese-Chinese politics. But also this phrase is also used in a different way, a different thing that we shouldn't forget. Don't forget 6/4 or June 4th. So again, that phrase can be used for historical/political references, but also more recent events. Another more recent event, so keywords can oftentimes be related to very contemporary events. In this case, the term the term rich woman refers to a specific rich woman, Guo Mei from in recent years. She actually was a woman who posted on Weibo that she was an employee of the Red Cross in China. And she then flaunted images of herself in front of a Maserati, in front of her Hermes handbags, first-class plane tickets. And obviously, Chinese netizens were outraged that someone associated with a charity could be so rich, and they wondered how she got her wealth. Eventually, did this human flesh search. Essentially, netizens banding together to figure out who a person is, and they figured out who she was. And she had to come out and apologize. The Red Cross in China had to come out and say, disassociate themselves from her and say that she actually wasn't an employee. In the end, actually, this event had severe repercussions on the Red Cross in China, and their donations fell by something up to close to 50% the following year. So the power of internet users in China. Two more, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So this one, Gao Yao Qi. This one's just sort of fun. Gao Yao means like plaster medicine, or it's like plastic, and Qi is flag. So that refers back to the sort of like medicinal patch that Chinese users like, to Chinese folks use for healing themselves, but it's also a coded insult for the Japanese flag and Japanese people because it sort of looks like the Japanese flag. So that's another fun one, playing with images. And then the last one we'll do, satellite television is actually, again, a lot of these words are out there. I'm just putting out my best guess, but in this case, the reason why this might be blocked may be due to the fact that back in, I believe, in the 1990s, Rupert Murdoch tried to enter China by creating this satellite television company, Sky. And he actually stated in an interview, advances in technology communications have proved an unambiguous threat to totalitarian regimes. And basically said that we're coming for you, China. We're going to bring in satellite TV. We're going to open up your country. And Chinese folks didn't take too kindly to this. The Chinese authorities actually banned satellite television. So satellite dishes are technically illegal in China. And then Rupert Murdoch actually had to spend the next decade trying to recover from that faux pas and trying to suck up to the Chinese government. If you wander around China today, even though satellite dishes are technically illegal, you'll find that folks have decided to flaunt or flout that ban. So I think that's the keywords that I'll just present today. If you're interested in more, of course, you could read my book or my blog, Blocked on Weibo. But I just wanted to close today by talking a little bit about what we can take away from this. Seeing how Chinese authorities regulate the internet and control the information online, I think is fascinating, not just in a purely China context, but also looking at how things are affecting regions around the world, not just authoritarian regimes in Iran, Syria, and elsewhere, but also here in the US, in Europe. You have all sorts of tension between private companies, between governments, between internet users about how much information is allowed to be shared online and what sorts of information shouldn't be shared and who gets to decide. I think that's sort of the conversation that hopefully my book will be able to spur. Where do we actually draw the line between trying to protect the security of everyone versus trying to promote and allow folks to have the individual expression that we so need in societies. So hopefully the book isn't something that's purely out there to attack China, but instead it's an opportunity to understand the motives for why authorities might decide to censor certain content. And by doing this, we can hopefully figure out ways to provide incentives and try and understand how to nudge authorities to trying to dismantle some of these obviously very restrictive environments that we have around the world today. So thank you so much for having me, and be happy to take any questions that you all have. I'll be able to stand here. So if you guys have any questions about China, particular keywords, about my research, or anything else? Yep.
So, what are the ages of the people who are saying these kind of keywords? Are they younger? Because it seems like a lot of the keywords you mentioned have historical reference. So I'm wondering how much of that history is the younger people are cognizant of.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. The very fact that you have to use sometimes these coded keywords to get around the censors means that by the very nature that you're using these keywords, you're sort of losing out on communicating in a more direct fashion with the mass folks. So, using "yueyue" now or using that idiomatic phrase means that the censors are being effective. They're essentially cutting off a chance for you to connect with everyone. However, that's the push for internet users to try and use phrases that are coded in a way, but also very understandable to everybody. So for that idiomatic phrase, maybe not everyone knows it, but other things like May 35th, which is a coded keyword for June 4th, I think most folks in China do recognize what that means. And so it's trying to find, within that cat and mouse game, to try and find this, to walk the line of being evasive, but not so evasive that you don't actually connect with the internet users. So in terms of actual age, Weibo is primarily, like most social media, a youth-driven media. So folks, college kids, but it's also really been this powerful tool for not just youth and their frivolous, posting pictures of what they did last night, but also for activists and journalists. So you'll find a lot of those folks online on Weibo as well. So.
Is your book itself, like, if people search your book on Weibo, is it blocked? And secondly, did hashtags play any role in search query?
It was interesting. I was actually in Toronto, and someone came up and asked a question, or basically said, "Oh, I posted on Weibo that I was attending your talk, and I posted an image of your book, and within 5 minutes, the post disappeared." So I don't know if that's indicative of what's happening, but it's interesting. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but the blog, which the book is based on, isn't blocked in China, because I think it's written in English, and it doesn't really have a big user base in China, so it doesn't really matter to Chinese authorities so much. But that is interesting. As for hashtags, I think hashtags aren't quite as big a deal on social media in China because one, perhaps because of the language. Not issue, but language opportunity. Chinese is such more so much more compact than English in that each character actually represents an entire word. So 140 characters, you actually say a good amount of in 140 characters. So you don't really need hashtags as a way of like, this sort of reductive meme sort of a tool. So you're actually able to say what you want. But in Chinese social media, I think images are super powerful. Those get circulated so widely. Even images of whole essays. So you'll often find people who post, they'll actually type out, a 300, 400, 500 character essay, sometimes even longer, take an image of, or make an image of it and post that. And that sort of thing gets circulated very widely. So, yeah. No problem.
Because that last anecdote is an example of how this cat and mouse game evolves and you actually have different tactics being used. To what extent does your research or continued research on this indicate that there's a different way that sort of people trying to post censored information and the censors are going to interact? And I guess so the general question is you've got a very rich descriptive account sort of focused on particular words and themes, and you have stories associated with them. To what extent does this help you anticipate what future censorship and sort of dissident interaction is going to look like?
Yeah, I think what's particularly interesting is how internet users are trying to shift away from this sort of public-facing social media. So they've, as a lot of folks in authoritarian societies have realized that posting material publicly is great for sharing information. Sorry, I'll just repeat the question. So the question was about how does my research anticipate what sort of future shifts and trends will take place in social media in China. So, so public-facing social media is a great opportunity to connect with folks, but it's also an opportunity, or a chance for information controls to be placed on it. So I think a lot of folks are shifting away from public-facing social media like Weibo towards more semi-public or private social media like WeChat and other sorts of these chat clients that a lot of folks are using now on their mobile devices. So in this way, you could still have thousands of followers on WeChat, and you could blast out a post to them. But there's hopefully no overseer sneaking in and surveilling your conversation and censoring you and potentially dragging you to jail. So I think that's one potential shift. Yep.
Does your research give you any indication what portion of the censoring is somewhat automated and what portion is just totally human manual input?
Yeah, so the question was, based on my research, do I have a sense of how much of the censorship is automated and how much of it is human input? I think looking at my list, I think it was fascinating, especially to me. What was most fascinating to me was the human element involved. Like for instance, you'll notice that the word Hoobastank was blocked on Weibo for some time, and which was weird to me because from what I know, Hoobastank isn't a very politically active band or music act in China. But in fact, what I think was happening there was the English word tank, which is part of Hoobastank, was the blocked keyword. But in fact, when I searched for the word tank at that same time, tank was unblocked and Hoobastank, or maybe the word stank itself, was blocked. So maybe there was a typo somewhere. So these are the sorts of things that you uncover. And other sorts of research that I've done at the Citizen Lab with collaborators up there, we've noticed also various incidences of the human censors making mistakes. Sometimes they'll upload a list of blacklisted keywords, and they'll accidentally unencrypt, or they'll accidentally encrypt it the wrong way, and it doesn't work, and you'll see them frantically uploading a new file 30 minutes later. So there's a human element involved, and I think even more, providing more insight is this recent Reuters story about where they interview actual censors, human censors, who work at these facilities. And this one was in Tianjin, outside Beijing. And they said that there was something close to several thousand censors who work in a facility. They work in shifts. They work in 10-hour shifts. The folks come in. But they do have automated tools to help them identify and flag sensitive keywords. So there is computer assistance involved. There are algorithms that they've written, and they're constantly getting better in helping the human censors do their job even more thoroughly. Yeah.
So in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, one of the things they did was they did absurd things because they would make the government feel stupid to crack down. They would meet in worry about being seen to be silly or something? I don't know. Could you comment on that difference in that, that the use of absurdism versus blocking what seems like silly things?
Yeah, like I said with the question before about how do internet users walk that fine line between communicating to everyone and also still evading the censors. And one of the ways they do it is with humor, with funny images, with memes, with sort of these inside jokes. So for instance, back in recently, for the June 4th commemoration, which takes place every year in China, internet users actually posted an image of the tank man, but they replaced all the tanks with this giant rubber duck. So you had 4 giant rubber ducks, facing off against a guy. So that's absurd and silly. And for the government to crack down on that would sort of be a statement about how they're maybe not just not in favor of discussion of politically sensitive content, but also not in favor of humor. So that's one method. But yeah, it's obviously a similar. It's a tactic that I think internet users have recognized, that you don't purposely you don't punch the government in the face. Perhaps they've learned that that's not a very effective tactic. They've seen from Liu Xiaobo and other folks who go out there directly promoting political change. They tend to get dragged in, and that perhaps isn't an effective tactic. So what they do is they organize things like, everyone wears a black T-shirt on a particular day. They go out and walk the streets. They take a stroll. That's the sambu, which is their method for, I guess, the sort of eating ice cream in the square. So. I think both methods are important, supremely important in terms of, fermenting change in China and progress. You need serious political activists, but you also need these sort of lighthearted attempts to sort of show how ludicrous some of the censorship system is.
QQ, they have groups. Is the data available to do your kind of analysis on something like that, with the QQ groups and QQ instant messaging, kind of sort of stuff?
Yeah. QQ is another. The question was about can we also track censorship on QQ, which is a chat client within China. A chat client that's used around the world, but it's created by a Chinese chat company called Tencent. It's actually interesting. One of the first real major censorship gold mines or for censorship researchers was actually, I think it was in the late 1990s, or I forget when it was, but hackers actually figured out that QQ was storing on your computer a certain file that basically every time you typed information in your chat window, it would compare it with this file, and if anything was contained in that file, they would actually censor your content. So hackers actually extracted the keyword list and actually shared that widely, and I think that was one of the first instances of reverse engineering the sort of censorship that is built into these sort of systems. So there's definitely researchers who are actively looking into various ways that chat clients like QQ and WeChat and other social media are being used, are actively censoring and surveilling users.
How much of a metric do you have on the effectiveness? Because it seems like for all their censorship, I mean, it may block some casual users, but between all the evasions and all the ways people rephrase things, you said that in the case of like the Red Cross incident, they blocked the keyword, but it still affected their donations by 50%. So does it seem like the information is still getting out to the majority of people, or is it only the ones that are in the know who can work around it?
Yeah, the question was about how much do we, how effective do we actually think the sort of blocking and censorship is? Because based on what we've seen, internet users are able to evade the censors. So I think the answer is that, or I think one way to look at it is that we only know about certain, like for instance, the Red Cross incident. We know about that incident, but what about the many dozens, or for each of those cases, many dozens of cases that we don't know about? So we may just have a little tip of the iceberg. We can see these sort of ways where the internet users were able to evade the censors and were able to produce profound change, but there are many, the whole point of censorship is that it's obtuse. We'll never find out, we'll never know unless, more research gets done, someone releases information, that sort of thing. So, and based on other research that people have done, there's a study by Yu and Robinson where they look into why people actually want to evade censors, or why would people want to escape restrictions in China. And for the most part, folks aren't interested in engaging in political activism. Folks are really pretty much interested in just getting a stable internet connection, getting access to information. And so based on that sort of thing, you get the sense that Chinese internet users, the majority of them, are for the most part satisfied with the sort of material that they have online. They don't have YouTube, but they have Youku. They have, instead of Facebook, they have Yuanyuan. So this sort of thing, I think, appears to be taking place in China. But obviously there are hardcore, dedicated folks who are focused on expanding freedom of expression in China, making sure that there's social justice and that sort of thing, and they do play a large role in the social sphere.
So your research seems to be about the content that's censored, but how about the people? Are they anonymous on these social networks? Are they tracked? Are they surveilled? Do they feel like they may get in trouble if they post certain content?
Yeah. So the question was about this is about content that's being blocked, but what about the people who post this sort of content? Do they fear for their lives, or are there sort of ways for the government to track them? And the answer is yes. Social media in China, technically, for some time, the government's imposed a rule where social media had to require that people provide their real names to register. So obviously, there are loopholes to get around it. One of the ways the real name registration required was using your cell phone. So sometimes people would use just throwaway cell phones and stuff like that. But in theory, technically, every cell phone that you sign up for, technically the vendor is supposed to have your actual real information. But that's China. Or any country where this sort of thing is just like, come on, you're really gonna, yeah. So this has been a major issue, especially within over the past several months and over the summer, wherein Weibo and other social media have been targeting the so-called big Vs, these verified users on Weibo, who are these celebrities. They have millions of followers. They are very powerful. They're the power users of Weibo. And they're known publicly. They're intellectuals, scholars, activists, lawyers, but also just like actors and actresses and stuff like that. So, and we've seen that in March, the head of the State Internet Information Office actually brought in all of a bunch of big Vs and actually had dinner with them. He called them in, sat them down and said, look, we need to make sure that social media in the future isn't filled with rumors, isn't filled with malicious lies. We have to make sure that what we're posting is, supportive of a healthy society. So people got the message. And over the summer, actually, there was a big crackdown, and a lot of these big Vs were actually dragged in. There was one economic writer, Charles Shui, who was actually brought in. He had to do this forced confession. There were other folks who have been arrested recently. So it's clear that the government is very interested in targeting individuals as well, in addition to censoring content.
So I'm curious, it seems China has their own version of like Twitter and use Youku for YouTube and Baidu for Google. How much urgency do you sense from Chinese users to use the maybe Western generated products versus use their own and have less censorship on them? Because I don't sense a lot of need to use Google over Baidu, but it obviously could offer more freer sense of search.
Yeah, obviously there are hardcore folks within China who are very adamant about using products that aren't censored. So when Google did pull out of China, you had people laying wreaths and flowers at the Google office because they were really saddened by the fact that that a company like Google left China and now they were forced to use products like Baidu, which, if you haven't used Baidu, it's actually a pretty good search tool, so long as you're not searching for sensitive content. So I think that's sort of there are folks who are very very much into using Twitter and YouTube from within China. And the thing is, for the most part, if you want to use Twitter and Facebook within China, you have the tools to allow you to get access to them. It's not like Iran where sometimes they throttle the internet to the point where you can't use YouTube. You could actually use well, now VPNs are a little more dicey since it's harder to get a good solid VPN that works for a while. But you can use various types of circumvention tools to get access to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter from within China, and if you want to. The thing is, most folks, why go on Twitter when all your friends are on Weibo? It's network effects. So it's fairly entrenched at this point, Weibo and other sorts of social media. So I think for the most part, Chinese internet users, some of them may actually use domestic products out of patriotism. For the most part, I think folks are just, I don't know, not necessarily lazy, but that's the tool. That's the thing that loads up when they start their computer. That's what they use. So.
Sort of a follow-up on the question about people versus content, but away from the content creator side and specific journalists, cartoonists in recent months, and topics that are sanctioned, is there any sense, especially given that it's not just China, we've seen local news about metadata, data mining, and query analysis post facto, is there any sense or precedent that Sina might be saving query traffic across all users so that you can find who searched for particular things and sharing that with the government, and locating people whose browsing activity is questionable, not merely people posting?
Sure. So the question was, again, going back to whether the government is tracking or tracking people with regards especially to sucking up metadata, and whether or not we think companies like Sina or the government are using this sort of metadata as a way to figure out who should be brought in for questioning. So I think I certainly don't have knowledge of metadata being used in this sort of fashion. I think from the sort of anecdotal evidence that we have, it's more straight surveillance. If they know that you're a activist, they may get access to your WeChat account and then start tracking the messages you post. And then when you say, oh, I'm going to be having lunch at Chaoyang Square or whatever, they send an officer who follows you, and then you get there and you notice that the officer's there and you wonder how they got there. So that's the sort of thing that I think is their method for tracking sensitive people. As for figuring out from the vast big data, like who might be terrorists or whatever, I'm sure that their equivalent of the NSA is doing the same sort of thing that the NSA is doing here. But I don't know if individual netizens who are just like looking at pornography online should be worried that their metadata is going to be sucked up and then somehow they're going to end up in prison. I think the government, Chinese authorities, they're efficient. They know who they should be focused on, and I think that's not their primary target. Yep.
Another question, just you're referring to China's NSA, and we haven't really talked much about who is actually executing this censorship. I wonder if this is concentrated solely in the propaganda ministry that has controls on this, or are there multiple agencies or groups that are involved in censorship within China, from what you can infer from your research?
Yeah, so the question was about who's actually performing this sort of censorship, what government agencies and or folks are involved. And clearly, yeah, it's something that's politically driven in some ways. So you have this new bureau called the State Internet Information Office, which was sort of an offshoot of the State Council Information Office, which is now supposedly the lead figure for performing this sort of information control. But you have all these other ministries and bureaucracies that are involved, and but you also have not just these multiple agencies and bureaucracies, but you also have to notice that there's a national level of information control, but then you also have local officials who are involved. You have police, security bureaus, and other folks who have different interests than maybe the national agents. So you have these different layers, and then you throw into that you have private companies who are vested interest in preventing any sort of potentially even sensitive discussion taking place on their site. So you have another layer of censorship there, and then you have the actual users themselves who have to self-censor, who actually report on other users who are posting provocative content. So you have these multiple layers, and it's not very clear. It's not as simple as they're doing it, or it's them. It's very much a decentralized, diffused censorship system, which is, I think, a feature of the Chinese system. All right, I think everyone is too scared, and we're going to call it quits. All right, thanks so much, everyone, for.